welcome to today's show. Today we are busy with comparing growth. So we started with some financial maths and we started with simple growth, compound growth. So today we're just gonna compare them and also extend it into talking about some random growth there. So let's just jump right into it. So have you ever thought about comparing different types of growth? When I say comparing different types of growth is if you have a certain amount of money that maybe you want to save, do you just take a moment and compare which one will give you the best benefit? Or do you just take whichever one that comes your way? And remember, you have three types that you can choose from. It can be your simple growth, it can be your compound growth, and it can also be your random growth. Your random growth will be what depends on the stock market and the currency, the exchange rate, and all of that. Or it's just a simple growth that talks to a constant increase in terms of the amount that you have, or a compound growth which fluctuates and is not really so constant, and the rate of change is also not constant. So just take a moment and think about what will it mean to compare different types of growth. Remember that our big idea was growth. We have patterns under there. We spoke about graphs. We spoke about forming equations, which are models to use to try and predict what will happen in the future. Our context was based on society and also finance. Now, our patterns were three, as I said: simple, compound, and random. And then our data was actually equations and graph. We're exploring it using those two things there. Now remember, we use mathematics to describe growth. Yes, we can talk about it in random terms and in everyday language, but the big idea here is to use maths to compare the growth. Now, is there a pattern? That's one question you need to ask yourself. Secondly, can we develop a model to predict the growth? So that's one other question that you need to please ask yourself. Now, with simple growth, remember that we said it's when the measure or the change that we are measuring is always a constant change. And also this forms an arithmetic pattern. So what this means is from one term to the next, it's the same thing that we are adding throughout this particular term. So if this is the first term and I get to the second term, what I'm adding here will be the same as if I go to the third term there, and that will still be the same as what I add when I go to the fourth term. That's what simple growth is all about. Now let's just put this into context and do just one question that shows us exactly what it means to have a simple growth. But remember, the key word under simple growth is simple interest. Now, let's say we have a scenario where there's a person, Busi in this context, wants to invest 2,500 rands in a fixed deposit account. Now, what does fixed deposit mean? It means that there is no additional deposits that Busi will be making into this bank, in this account. It will only be this 2.5 that she deposits there and leave it for 5 years and watch it grow or watch it accumulate some interest in that particular order. And then we then also look at what is the interest rate that Busi is going to get for that duration. And then at the end, we will then look at what is the balance of what Busi will have in her account after the money that she has invested matures for the 5 years at that simple interest. Now, the first question we will look at is how much exactly will Busi earn in terms of the interest after 5 years. So what I'm going to do quickly is just to write down the data that we are dealing with. Remember, our principal amount here was 2,500 rands. And our interest that we're dealing with here is 12% simple interest. And then the duration is 5 years, right? So now, what this means is the first question wants us to look at how much interest will she earn after 5 years. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what is 12% of the principal amount, and that amount will then multiply it by the duration, which is the 5 years. So 12% of the 2,500, and then this will actually give us 300. That is 12% of the 2,500, and then that will be multiplied by 5, and this will give us 1,500. 1,500 in this context will be the total interest that she earns after the duration of her investment. But this is not what she will have in the bank. It is only what she would have earned for her initial amount that she deposited into the bank or into the fixed deposit account. The second question now wants to know exactly what will be the total balance in her account after 5 years. So remember that initially Busi started with 2,500, and then she gained 12% of the P amount, which I will just say P, and this was multiplied by the 5, and meaning the total will actually be equals to 2,500 plus the 1,500, which was the total interest, and then the total here will actually be 4,000. Now this will be the total amount that Busi will have in her account after 5 years. But remember that maths has made this easier for us to calculate this, not to do it in bits and pieces like we've just done. Instead, I can just say my A is equals to P, open bracket, 1 plus I multiplied by N. Remember, this is the simple interest formula. And this will be equals to P will be the principal amount she started investing with, and then 1 plus the interest. Remember, we don't write it as a percentage but as a decimal, and we multiply this by 5. And this will still give us the 4,000 that we spoke about with the previous example that we did with the calculation that we are doing. So the big idea here is, firstly, we look at how much interest will Busi gain in terms of her investment for 5 years, and then from there we look at how much will then she have as the total amount or the total balance in her account after the duration of her investment, specifically 5 years. But now let's compare this with compound growth and see exactly what is it that we're talking about. Just a quick reminder, compound growth is when a change is not constant. Also, the rate of change is also not constant. And then the last thing is this forms a geometric pattern, which consequently means that this is then an exponential graph and also an exponential equation. That's just a quick reminder of what exactly is a compound growth. Now, let's also put this into context so that we can compare the two. Now we have Tebo, who's also investing the very same amount of money for the same duration as Busi, but now the interest is no longer simple interest. Instead, it is compound interest, which is compounded monthly. Remember what we said in our last lesson was, if it's compounded monthly, it simply means that this person is going to get interest every month, but it must amount to 12%. So not necessarily that they're going to get 12% every month. No, they're going to get a certain portion of 12%. In this instance, it will be 1% every month for the duration of 12 months. But at the end of the year, it's supposed to then be 12%, because that's the total interest that they are offering Tebo in this context for every year, but compounded monthly. Now, we want to know how much interest will Tebo earn after the 5 years, right? So with this one, we will then go straight to the formula, because this is compound interest. 1 plus I to the exponent of n. Just quick reminders here. Remember that if it's compounded monthly, we say I must be divided by 12, and then n must be multiplied by 12, right? And then our P amount will be 2.5 into 1 plus, our I is 12%, which means it's 0.12. Then we divide this by 12. Why? Because it's compounded monthly. And then this will be to the exponent of the 5 multiplied by 12. 5 multiplied by 12. Why? Because every year, Tshepo will be getting interest 12 times for 5 years. Hence, it's 5 times the 12. All right, so let's just go straight to our calculator for this. Our principal amount will be 2,500, and then 1 plus 0.12 divided by 12, and this will be to the exponent of 5 multiplied by 12, which is actually 60, and then I want to find out what my total would be. So my total will be 4,541. So this will be equals to 4,541,74, I think. Now, as you can see here, if we go back to the previous question about Busi had 4,000, investing the very same amount for the same duration at the same interest rate. But it was now a different growth that we're looking at. Busi's growth was simple interest, whereas Tshepo's growth is compound interest. So this tells us that the compound interest will actually be then the best option to actually choose. So this is what I wanted you to think about. As I started, I said to you, do you ever think about comparing different types of growth with the same amount that of money that you want to save and the same interest rate that you want to get from the bank, but at different growth patterns? So either simple growth, compound growth, or random growth, which we'll get to just now. So you can see that simple growth does not really give you that much, although people will think that, oh, because I'm getting the same amount of money every year, it will make my my amount grow bigger, which is not really the fact. Because with compound growth, it means you are getting 12% of what you have at the end of that year, each and every year. So if for the first year I get 12%, which is 300 rands, the second year I will get 12% of 2,800 rands, not 2,500 rands like we started with Busi's example. Now, with random growth, this will be real-world scenarios which do not always follow a pattern, so there's some fluctuation here. So we might look at it as it's something straight, and then it starts to go up, and then it starts to go down, it goes up, it goes like that. So that's what it really means to have a real-world scenario. This will depend on things like inflation. It will also depend on things like what is happening in terms of our exchange rate and all of that. Then changes cannot always be predicted. So this is one thing that is very difficult to do here. Remember, with our simple and our compound, we spoke about trying to develop a model that assists us in trying to predict what is going to happen in the future. But here, we cannot do that. Although some mathematicians and economists are trying to do this, it's not really easy to predict what will happen in the future. Why? Because there is some fluctuations at times, there is a drop at times, there is a rapid increase, so it's quite random, and there is no constant nature of growth that we can be looking at with a random pattern. And also, the change can be uncertain and also volatile. As we said, it depends on exactly what is happening between maybe two states or between two currencies. Then mathematical models look at trends. So we normally use trends, and we also use cycles to try and look at this. With trends and cycles, we're looking at maybe for 5 years, what has been happening? For 2 years, what has been happening? Okay, let's say for a year, what has been happening? For 5 months, what has been happening? But I will bring more of this just after the ad break. For now, let's quickly go to an ad break. Stay tuned, I'll be back with some more. Hi, Hi guys, welcome from the ad break. So we are still talking about comparing interests and also comparing growth. The last thing that we spoke about was some random growth. Now we're gonna explore random growth in great detail. We specifically gonna use foreign exchange just to see exactly what are these trends and models that I spoke about before we went to our ad break. And we'll be using the strength between a rand and a US dollar. And we'll be looking at exactly what does it mean to have a random increase or a random decrease or a fluctuation or an exchange rate that is different from that one and that one. So that's what we're really going to be looking at. But quickly, let's just recap what we've been doing so far. So remember, our big idea is growth. And then also we're looking at patterns with growth. We're looking at also graphs. We're looking at equations, which are the models that we use to predict the future together with the graphs. And also our context is between society and finance. Specifically now, we're going to look at some finance. All right, so our context in this particular lesson will be in finance, which is the exchange rate, because this is what actually assists us in looking at what it means to have a random growth, a decrease, an increase, a fluctuation, and all of that. Remember, foreign exchange will be an international trade that is not done in local currency, right? In local currency, it would mean that here we're talking about things like ZAR, which is what we are having locally. But this trade is mostly done in US dollars, right? US dollars, because this is like your most common used currency in almost all the states. So this is what makes it easier for us to be able to buy things maybe in the US when we are here in South Africa, or to buy things in maybe England when we are here in South Africa. So that's the most common trade that is being used. And then also, the cost of buying $1 will give you a clear indication of how strong currency is. Now, one typical example here is when you are watching the news. You know, just before we get to our weather forecast, they normally talk about the exchange rate and talk about what the cost of $1 is as compared to a rand, what £1 is as compared to the rand or to the dollar as well. So those are the things that we are talking about. So this actually tells you whether our currency is strong or is weak. But now let's actually understand what exactly does it mean. It means that the more you pay, the weaker the currency. Now, in the past months or so, we've been dealing with things like COVID-19. So what that has done is it has weakened our currency. Hence, we're actually buying $1 with 17 rands. It has actually gone to that particular price. So that was quite a very big increase in terms of our exchange rate. But you can see that everything is then a fluctuation, because it was first maybe 16 rand, 17 rands, then it will go to like 14, 15 rands. So it will be fluctuating and not staying at the same amount every year or every month for that matter. So that's what actually tells us. So the more money you pay, the weaker the rand is, or the weaker the currency of that state is when you compare the two states. Now, what does the 20-year trend tell you about the strength of the rand, right? Remember, I said I'm going to use rand and the US dollar to try and look at the trend. Now, we're going to talk about whether our trend is linear or exponential. But let's look at an actual graph of this. On the graph, you can see that if you start here by 2005 and go to roughly 2008, it looks like it's a linear trend, right? I can even draw a line there and it shows me a linear trend. But if you look at between maybe 2009 and 2017, you can see it's more like an exponential trend there. And then you look at between 2017 and 2020, you look at it, it also becomes something like an exponential trend there, which is not a linear trend. Although this is the case, it actually shows us that At one point, we can have it as a linear. At one point, we can have it as an exponential. At one point, we can even have it as a parabolic, which is the last point there on this particular graph. So this is what actually tells us the issue of the exchange rate and what exactly does it mean when you are comparing a dollar and a South African rand. But remember that this was a 20-year trend. Now let's just narrow it down and maybe look at 10-year trend, right? Now with the 10-year trend, the graph will look something like this. Now you can see, I can now see a clearer trend in terms of what is happening with the foreign exchange. It looks a bit more linear now, a bit flat, and also even here it looks a bit parabolic, but not that much parabolic. So it's a bit closer to also being linear. So meaning, if I look at a shorter year trend of the foreign exchange between a dollar and a South African rand, I can actually get a closer look as to what is happening in the foreign exchange. But let's also narrow it down again. Now, if we take it now further to being smaller than 10 and we take 5 years, this trend will then look a bit flatter now. So here, it does not show much fluctuation or so, but it looks like it's a bit of a flat trend where there's not too much fluctuation, there is not too much decrease or too much increase. And that's what we are talking about. If we summarize this, it actually then means that let's also go back and look at if it's a 6 month trend, right? With a 6 month trend, now it looks like this is a decrease. And if it's a decrease, you can see that it means that we are now buying the cost of $1 in terms of rands is a bit decreasing. So remember what I said when we're talking about the more you pay, it means the currency is weaker. But now, the less you are paying, it means our currency is a bit stronger. So that's what the foreign exchange is. Now, what this is, when we look at different time periods, you can then get a better overall picture of random growth. But this random growth normally repeats in cycles. So you saw that with a 20-year trend, there was more like a linear trend, and then it became a exponential trend, and then it became a parabolic trend. So you can see that it is quite repeating itself with cycles that we are dealing with. And the cycles will be if there is an impact of a certain disease that we maybe need to deal with at that particular time, or it has to do with maybe elections and all of those. So those are all the factors that will be contributing to all of this that is happening in the foreign exchange. And if we take a closer look at different time frames, we can then see that, okay, the trend is a bit better to actually look at maybe from this particular perspective, which is 6 months, as compared to maybe 20 years. Because with 20 years, it's a broader picture, which does not really show us a clearer trend of what we are trying to look at. And then when we look at this, what you also need to see when it comes to a trend is, if your trend goes something maybe like this, which I think you've seen these graphs, normally in the news and all of that, this would mean that we are actually paying more money to actually get $1, right, in rands. What does that mean? It means that our currency would be actually very weak at that time, because for the currency to be strong, it means we must take out very minimal amount of money to then buy shares. So this will also talk about, you know, those people that are investing in stock exchange and all of that. There will be a time where they are pulling away from stock exchange and saying, no, I can't invest anymore. And there will be a time where everyone is just saying, hey, it's Christmas, let's all just buy shares. Why? Because you'll find that the currency is a bit weaker, stronger at that time, meaning I am buying the exchange rate of $1 at a very minimal amount. But if I'm buying it at a very high amount, people will not be exchanging their currencies and all of that. So that's what we are actually talking about. So this is a clear indication of what random growth means. There's a fluctuation, it's not linear, it's not exponential, it's not also constant. So meaning what? it changes over time. With time, there's a change in the growth that we're looking at. And a very big example of this will be the exchange rate. That's it from me right now, guys. Let's go to a quick ad break and we'll be back with some more. Stay tuned. Hi guys, welcome back. This is our last segment for the show. I hope you've been enjoying, and I hope right now you have a clear indication of what it means to compare growth. But now we're also going to take it further and actually look at some numbers. Exactly what does it mean to compare growth? So stay with me and I will take you places. Let's just look at what we've done so far. So our big idea, which we always gonna go back to, was growth. We looked at patterns, graphs, equations. Our context has been on finance because we're trying to assist ourselves in trying to make better financial decisions or to make better financial choices when it comes to maybe saving and all of that. Now, with this inflation here, the concept now that we are talking about is inflation, which is actually the rate at which, so this will be the rate at which the price of goods and services increases every year. Now, guys, I think you know what this means. They've been saying rate of inflation or rate of living or standard of living is too high. You know when people are saying that just randomly and haphazardly in our society. What that means is, just yesterday, we used to buy bread with like 10 rands. Now bread is like 17 rands. And in the future, it might be 30 rands to buy some bread. So this is what inflation actually means, that yesterday it was this, today it's that, tomorrow it will be this. So you see, the differences there is what inflation is all about. Similarly with goods, with services as well. Yesterday, you find that for you to go to the doctor, it was a bit cheap, but today is a bit quite pricey. Tomorrow, it might be more pricey because then more people are getting sick and medicine is getting more expensive and doctors are getting more expensive. So you see, all of that has to do with inflation, goods and services going up in terms of the price. And that's the rate that we are looking at. Now, to go further on this, we say this can vary from year to year. When I'm saying from year to year, you know that the previous year, was the price for a certain thing that we used maybe to buy every day. And then the following year, it's different. And the following year, it will be different. And the following year, it will be different. So this normally varies from year to year. Now, we have what we call the South African Reserve Bank. That's where we get our money from, or those are the people that actually create the money for us. And the Treasury, they normally aim to keep the inflation rate between 3 and 6% per annum. So what does this mean? It means the rate at which goods and services are increasing is normally between 3 and 6%. And not really more than 6% or less than 3%, but depending on what is happening in our country at that time or what is happening in the society at that time. You know, there's a lot of factors that will affect how the rate is increased. Maybe there's high demand or there is less demand or not a lot of people can afford, and then you see then they start playing around with the rate of inflation for the coming years. Because one thing for sure is everything gets a bit more expensive as the years progresses, but how expensive it gets, it normally depends on a number of factors that I'm sure you also know and you are seeing on the news when they are talking about those. Now also, the midpoint of the targeted inflation rate is normally 4.5, right? So when you're sitting at 4.5, you're roughly a bit safe in terms of it increasing or it staying at whatsoever the price is at the time. Now let's just look at some graph that actually it tells us what is happening with the inflation in South Africa in specific. So this talks about the consumer price inflation, which was 2.2 in June 2020, and then which was up from 2.1 in May 2020. What does this mean? It means that at this point here, things will be 2.2% more expensive than it was in the previous month or in the previous year or in the previous decade and so you see, this is what actually shows you what exactly it means. But you can see that it fluctuates, it goes up, it goes down, it becomes a bit linear, it continues to go down, it goes up. So this is all about inflation. And all of this has been dependent on what is happening at that present moment. So was there maybe a virus that we're dealing with, or was there maybe unemployment that we're dealing with? Was there maybe a lot of people not being able to meet their ends meet in terms of the goods and services that they need, especially the most important goods and services? So those are the things that actually affect this annual consumer price inflation, as you can see, from like 2015 up until 2020. And like in June, it was roughly 2.2. And this would mean that it was 2.2% more expensive to buy maybe bread or to buy petrol or to buy something that you need the most at home. And then with also the concept of inflation, we know it's normally compounded over time. Now, let me explain what this means. Inflation has nothing to do with a constant increase. It will never be that way. We just saw now in the previous graph that it normally at times goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it remains a bit linear for some time, and then it continues depending on what the factors are. So what this means is it will never be a linear growth or a linear decrease for that matter. It's a fluctuation of going up, going down, going up, linear bit, up, down, and all of that. So inflation is compound interest and not simple interest. So please make sure that when you see a question and it talks about inflation, automatically you must be thinking about compound interest and not simple interest. And also, when the rate of inflation decreases, prices still increase, but at a slower rate. Now, remember what I said the definition was. Inflation is the rate at which, not necessarily that the rate of inflation maybe will be decreasing, therefore the prices are a bit cheaper in that time. No, that's not what it means. It just means that they are still increasing, but now they are increasing at a very slow pace, a slow rate over time, not necessarily as a rapid increase of maybe prices for our goods and services. Now, you must also consider inflation when making investment decisions. Guys, please remember that everything that we've spoken about does not constitute as financial advice. I don't know much about that. This is just me using numbers, which is mathematics, just for you to look at how can you make certain decisions. And mostly when you go to financial advisors, they will definitely try to tell you that you must take advantage of compound interest. But let's see, how do you exactly take advantage of maybe compound interest? Should it be for a short period of time? Should it be a long period of time? Or should it be a very long period of time? Let's just have a look at those two differences. Now, there's an item that costs 1,000 today, right? If the average rate of inflation is 4.5, how much will the item cost in, please think about this, 5 years? Or in 10 years. We are going to compare the two. If you look at a graph for this, you can see that the inflation rate is 4.5, right? After 5 years, this would actually cost 1,250. And it's supposed to double here, but when it's doubling here, it's just below 10 years. So it does not take the same amount of time for the increase to double, which is the 250. But when it gets to 10 years, it's slightly more than the initial increase, which was the 250. So it's a bit more than twice the rate of inflation that we are talking about here. Now, the question that we're going to then try to ponder on is, instead of buying this item now, which maybe I might not afford it, what will happen if Joseph invests that amount in a fixed deposit account that earns him interest of 4.5, the same inflation rate that we are talking about, but now at simple interest. Will he have saved enough to buy the item in, let's say, 5 years or in 10 years? We're just going to look at whether Joseph will have. Remember how much Joseph must have. It must be slightly above 1.5, right? So maybe we can say 1.6 something or 1.5 and 60 rands in 10 years' time. And then in 5 years' time, it will cost 250 more. So we're just going to see whether Joseph will actually have enough after 5 years at simple interest, after 10 years at simple interest. So we can see that after 5 years at simple interest, Joseph will have slightly less of that amount. So it will be slightly less than what that item will actually be costing at the time. But if you look at 10 years, it will be way more than less in terms of the inflation rate at that time. So you can see now it's even below the 1.5 mark, and the inflation would be above the 1.5 mark. So you can see it's a bit quite low. But now let's see if it was now not simple growth and it's compound growth. What would that mean? Now, instead of buying this, then Sarah says, nah, I want to invest this at an interest that is 6.5%, right? Which is 2% more than the inflation rate. But now at compound interest and not on simple interest. We need to look at whether she will have saved enough to buy the item in 5 years or in 10 years. In 5 years' time, if we look at this, this is where Sarah will be, right? Sarah will be at 1,379 cents. So this is quite more than the 1,250, which that item would be costing at the time. But if you look at a 10-year period, she will actually be at a higher amount of money. So she will actually have some excess amount there after buying that item if it's on a compound growth. But now what we need to look at is Sarah actually went for 2% more than what the inflation rate is. So this will actually be showing us that compound interest is the way to go. But it depends on what your financial decisions will be and what your financial needs are at the time. And please remember, all that I'm saying, I'm just using maths and numbers to show you how you can look at different comparisons when it comes to the growth. Not necessarily financial advice or anything like that. So please remember that. And then we will look at, if it's compound interest, you can see that the longer you leave your amount of money that you saved, the more money you get. The shorter, yes, you will still get more money, but not really that much more. Whereas if it's a longer period, it will even double up. Remember when you spoke about compound interest, we said the longer the period, the shorter the doubling up of the interest. But the longer the shorter the period towards the end, there you will see that it actually doubles up quite very quick. So compound interest is the way to go. But let's just summarize this quickly. Remember that when we study growth, we're looking at what it means to have change, right? We are measuring change, the rate of change. We are measuring whether the change is constant or not constant. Remember, it is only constant when we are dealing with the simple growth, together with the rate of change is also constant when we're dealing with our simple growth. And then simple growth is normally linear, meaning it's a straight line like that. But with compound growth, remember that it does not really have a constant change or even a constant rate of change. And what this means is with a compound interest or with compound growth, it follows a geometric pattern. And then this then goes to it being an exponential, and it then takes time to show an increase. Guys, time is very important when you are saving under compound growth. So the quicker you start your investment, the better returns you are going to get from that. And then so far we've looked at simple, compound, and some random growth. We looked at also random growth being something that is a combination of simple and compound growth, because at times it's a bit linear, at times it's fluctuating, at times it's going down, at times there's a lot of inflation that is taking place, at times the currency is strong, the currency is weak. So it's just a fluctuation and a very random thing that is happening. The trend may not always show an increase, but could follow a cycle. So every 5 years you can see that it's increasing or decreasing, and you know there are people who are actually trying to predict this. Hence, we always see this on the news and on every social media that we're looking at. And then lastly, everything that we've looked at is the big concept of growth. We linked this to what we call patterns, because every growth follows a certain pattern. And then we used graphs to try and analyze what exactly does it mean to have growth. We used equations, and then our context was on society. Remember, a virus, unemployment rate at that time, exercising, health, and all of those things. Socio-economic backgrounds and all, that's what we're talking about. And then lastly, we looked at the concept of finance. So all of this, guys, is just you punching the numbers, playing with the numbers, comparing what works for you, what are your needs, and always just doing some maths. Remember, guys, mathematics is food for the soul. Till next time.